All these slides I'm about to show you, I'm looking at decades and decades of data, and I'm comparing countries that get very high scores in the economic freedom rankings to countries that get very low scores in the economic freedom rankings. So in this first example, we see that Singapore and Jamaica, back in the 1960s, they had very similar living standards. Well, Jamaica has had a big government interventionist economy, whereas Singapore has become a very free market oriented economy. And you can see this is per capita GDP. You can see that Singapore's living standards have exploded, whereas Jamaica has stayed relatively poor. This next example compares Hong Kong and Cuba. Now, I'm not very optimistic about Hong Kong in the future because China is cracking down and beginning to take over. But for decades, Hong Kong was the most free economy in the world. And you can see that Hong Kong and Cuba had very similar living standards in the 1950s. Then Hong Kong decided to go with free markets, and Cuba decided to go with communism, i.e. technical, true socialism. And what happened? Hong Kong is now far, far richer, far more prosperous than Cuba. Let's look at Africa. There aren't very many good examples of free market economies in Africa, but one of the highest ranked countries for free markets is Botswana. It's not high compared to Hong Kong and Singapore, but by African standards, it's a free market economy. And you can see Botswana is the darkest line. And you can see that Botswana, going back to the mid-1960s, was one of the poorest places in Africa, and now it's more than twice as rich than many of the other sub-Saharan African economies. The point I want to make as I'm showing you all these slides, it doesn't matter what part of the world you're looking at. The recipe of free markets and limited government always delivers more prosperity than either true socialism or redistributionism. Here's a chart showing that the United States back in 1950 was more than 4 times richer than Hong Kong and Singapore. Now let's look at the data over time. You can see that Hong Kong and Singapore, well, Singapore has passed the United States, and Hong Kong had basically caught up to the United States. Now, again, I suspect Hong Kong will begin to fall now that China has taken control, but you can see that over several decades, free markets and small government were very beneficial for Hong Kong and Singapore. Here's a different way of looking at the data, and this is a comparison of Hong Kong and Argentina. Argentina is a very interesting story because back in the 1930s, 1940s, even as late as 1950s, it was one of the 10 to 15 richest economies in the world. But then under Peronism, which was sort of cronyism, redistributionism, interventionism, fascism, and some socialism, Argentina wiped out economic liberty, and they went from being a very rich country by world standards to dramatically falling in the global rankings, whereas Hong Kong, because it went with very free market policy, rose in the rankings. Here's an example from the post-communist world. It shows that when the Soviet Union collapsed, Poland was a little bit poorer than Ukraine. Well, Poland has done a good bit of economic reform. It's not Hong Kong, it's not Singapore, just like Botswana wasn't, but by global standards and by post-Soviet standards, Poland's done a pretty good job, and they're now almost twice as rich as Ukraine. Ukraine has done almost no economic liberalization, and you can see the consequences. Ukraine hasn't had any growth, whereas Poland has had good growth. Here's an example from Latin America. It compares 1980 and 2008. 1980 is the blue, 2008 is the red or the purple or maroon, whatever color that is. You can see that Chile used to be the poorest country when looking at Chile, Argentina, and Venezuela, but now Chile's the richest. Well, Chile, by far in Latin America, has the highest level of economic freedom, whereas Venezuela, of course, is the bottom-ranked country, and Argentina also has pretty bad policy. So you can see that Argentina's only had a little growth, Venezuela's had almost no growth, whereas Chile has more than doubled its living standards. Again, this is over decades and decades of data. Here's an example that's very powerful. North Korea versus South Korea. They used to have the same living standards. North Korea is a genuine socialist economy, government owning the means of production, running the factories, collective farms, all that stuff. South Korea is a free market economy. Dramatic difference in living standards. The same people, but with different economic systems. And you can see the difference in terms of prosperity for South Korea versus economic misery for North Korea. Here's Cuba versus Chile. Chile was always richer than Cuba, but it was roughly the same ratio, maybe twice as rich. But ever since Chile went with economic reforms in the 1980s and moved toward economic liberty, their living standards have grown much, much faster. Here's another example from the post-Soviet world. It shows that Estonia, it had a bubble. You can see that their economy grew and then had a bubble, but then fell down. But even after the bubble, you can see that Estonia has grown much faster than the world has grown. The same thing is true, by the way, for Ireland. They also had a bubble in 2008 that burst. But you look at the long run data over 3 decades, you can see that Ireland has grown much faster than the world, and Ireland is in the top 10 for economic freedom. Estonia, by the way, is in the top 20 for economic freedom. Here's Botswana versus all of Africa. So this chart is actually easier to see and understand. You can see how Botswana, being one of the few free market oriented economies in Africa, has grown much faster than the average African economy. Here's Chile versus the world. You can see that Chile, especially when communists took over in the 1970s, they fell down to the world average. Now Chile's much richer than the world average. Here's Taiwan and South Korea compared to the world average. Taiwan and South Korea, Taiwan's in the top 20. I think South Korea is in the top 30. This is measuring 160 plus countries in the world, and you can see how they've grown much faster than the world average over multiple decades. Now, I want to focus a bit on China here, and I'm going to show 4 different charts, because a lot of people think China is a big success story, and in some sense, it is. When they began to partially liberalize their economy in the late 1970s, early 1980s, you can see that all of a sudden they went from utter economic misery to having a lot of growth. And that sounds great, but notice that the chart peaks at $14,000 per capita GDP. What happens if you put the chart at $45,000 per capita GDP? Well, then China's growth doesn't look quite as impressive. Now, you may be asking, why did I set the chart at $45,000 GDP? Well, for a very important reason, because if we add Taiwan to this chart, and Taiwan is in the top 20 for economic freedom, you can see that Taiwan has grown much, much faster and is much, much richer than China. And what's the reason for the difference? Well, as of a couple of years ago, they're actually higher than this now. As of a couple of years ago, Taiwan was number 21 in the world for economic liberty, and China was 112. I think China's actually dropped now to 122. I have a few more examples, and then I'll close up. This shows that France used to be more than twice as rich as Hong Kong, and now Hong Kong is much richer than France. Why? Because France has too much government, and Hong Kong, at least historically, was very free market oriented. Here's West Germany versus East Germany. Now, obviously, this chart ends in 1990 when the Berlin Wall fell, but after World War II, East Germany and West Germany were very similar in their per capita GDP, obviously. It was very low, of course. They had just been defeated in a war, but look at how much faster West Germany grew than East Germany. That's capitalism versus true, genuine socialism. Here's another example. This is the language, of course, it's in Slovakian, I believe, but it shows Czechoslovakia versus Finland, Austria, and Germany. And you can see that after World War II, those countries all had similar living standards, but the free market oriented economies grew much, much faster and became much, much richer than Czechoslovakia, at least up until communism collapsed. 2 final examples. There's a theory, I should have mentioned this probably at the start. There's a theory called convergence. And the convergence theory says that a poor country should grow faster than a rich country and catch up. But that's only true if they have the same policy. And this chart shows per capita GDP for Western Europe compared to the United States. And you can see that it starts in 1950. You can see after World War II, Western Europe was catching up to the United States. But then all of a sudden, about 1980, Europe stopped catching up. And the average per capita GDP in Europe is only about 70% of US levels. Why? Because starting with Ronald Reagan, the US shifted much more toward free markets, and Europe had adopted these big welfare states in the 1960s and 1970s, and those big welfare states slowed European growth. And so the point is that the United States, sometimes people see the US as the economy to emulate. I don't think that's true. If you want to have an economy to emulate, probably today it's Singapore. And you can see that some countries do catch up to the United States, and they even pass the United States. Singapore has passed the United States. Switzerland has passed the United States. Hong Kong did catch up to the United States, but is now falling back. What do we know about those countries? They actually have higher levels of economic freedom than the United States. So here's the question I want all of you to think about tonight, tomorrow, and for the rest of your lives. Whenever you run into someone who defends the welfare state or defends socialism or defends big government, I want you to ask them this question. Can they identify a single example of their countries producing success? I just gave you 20 different examples using decades of data showing that more market-oriented countries, countries with smaller government, grow faster and do better. And whenever I'm debating one of my left-wing friends, I tell them, please put on the screen showing decades of data, show me examples of big government, socialist, redistributionist, however you want to define it, show examples of countries with big governments and lots of redistribution or socialism or welfare states, show examples of those countries outperforming countries that are more market-oriented with small government. They can't do it because there is literally not a single example anywhere in the world to defend their position in favor of the welfare state